YouTube, Awesome Rider here. This is going to be my series review for Kamen Rider Saber. Obviously, it's going to be chock full of spoilers. Let's dive into it, though. I have two things to say at the beginning, though. First, the basic bench YouTube speech. If you want to see more of these videos, just make sure to like and subscribe. Well, I guess you don't have to like to see more of the videos. That would be pretty harsh. But make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you get more notifications for Kamen Rider videos like this and all kinds more videos. And then like the video if you enjoyed it. But the other thing I wanted to say at the beginning is I know some people will watch these type of videos to see if they should check out a series or not, which I never understand. Like, why would you want to watch a spoiler video explaining everything before you watched it? But just in case, if you're here for that, I would say that this is a very mixed series, but I say it's worth checking out on your own. I think regardless of whether I liked this series, I think it's worth checking out without thinking about anybody else's opinions to decide for yourself. But I'll just say that I liked it enough that I would recommend someone checking it out because I think it could be a good Rider series for some people. Some people may love it even more than I liked it. So, let's get started. I usually kind of break these down by plot and characters, but in this one I'm going to do something I did previously, and I'm going to break it down by positive and negatives for the most part. Of course, when I talk about the positives, some negatives might come up and vice versa. But let's start with the positives, and let's start superficial. Designs, I love the designs. I mean, I don't love every single design, but for the most part, this is probably one of my more favorite groups of designs they've done. Just the general theme hits a lot of buttons for me. At first, I was kind of weird where, you know, objectively it would hit the right buttons, but I wasn't that into it. But the more I watch the series, the more I just really like the designs. I think they're perfect for a many Rider series where we get to see just a ton of different forms. And, you know, even though there's some I like more than others and some I don't care for as much, just overall, great suits in this series. And I also think the gimmick is really strong. I mean, toy-wise and jingle-wise, I think they're a bit much. I think they could take about 20% off. But, like, they talk way too long, sing way too long, they sing over each other, like they literally open a book and read it to you. But just in terms of the creativity of the gimmick, I think it's one of the coolest ones we've had. It fits very well with both themes having the knight swords that unsheath and become the big swords. Heyo! But I think that's really cool. I think the storybooks with the sounds for the toys and for the show is really neat. And even though, you know, I'm also annoyed at how much we were getting Rider belt tumors constantly with these giant gimmicks, I think this series had some of the most creative ones in terms of the way they flow together, whether it's the storybooks flowing together or some of the bigger gimmicks later. I just thought it was a really cool gimmick theme that had a lot of creativity, and I think they took full advantage of both themes with that. Speaking of, that's another positive I would say of the series, is I think it did an excellent job of taking advantage of both of its themes. Whether or not you liked the story, I think they successfully, almost equally, took it full advantage of the knight theme and the storybook theme. I say almost because I think the overall theme of the show was, you know, stories and they're important to people, but you know what I mean, especially since there's some series where they kind of fail at that promise. Mainly I'm looking at you, Ghost, since this was done by some of the same people, and Ghost had a paranormal and eyeball theme, and they doubled down on interdimensional eyeball people. And being a huge paranormal fan, I was very disappointed, Matt. So I was very happy to say that they really did a good job of using both knight themes and storybook themes, and I think they weaved them together well. And fortunately, those are two themes that I think can go well together. Sometimes Rider has like Armored Fruit Warriors or doctors and video games that end up working, yes. But on paper, when you first see them, you think, how are they going to do this? But, you know, Knight, the Round Table, and storybooks go hand in hand. Also, speaking of story, another positive is I think they had really cool lore. I really loved the lore behind the season. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing, I think, with sort of the metaphor of the Wonder World, whether it was real or it was real created by people's stories. But once you think about it enough and pay attention, it makes sense. And I think they did a good job of explaining it. They had several key points throughout the show where they would have scenes explaining the backstory and mythology, and I found it to be an interesting and well thought out mythology, at least in my opinion, that I really dug. And they, you know, they went into it in some of the other like bonus specials and stuff too, but I thought that was another positive of the series. Also, in regards to a positive for the plot, it was a rocky go, and something I'll bring up in the negatives is a little bit fast-paced for my taste at the beginning. But once you get into it, and once they calibrated a little bit more, it had a really good momentum and gotta watch the next episode factor that kept me invested in terms of I was looking forward to seeing the next episodes, especially in a binge format. And I really liked that. And I think just overall the series in regards to that, I think is especially appealing to people that might not be as jaded as me, or might be early Rider fans that might like this even more. Because I found myself after I took a break and coming back to this series, I found myself trying to get myself into the mindset of younger Dawson when I was less jaded and less sick of certain things about Toku. And it really did have a lot of those things about Rider that I liked in terms of character stories and plot stories. That's what plot is, Dawson. But you know what I mean, where it was fairly engaging and it had a good flow and there wasn't a lot of meaningless filler, and it just kind of kept me wanting to watch, and it reminded me of why I like Rider, and the more serialized nature of Rider is something that I've always preferred over Sentai, so it would remind me of that. Now, let's get to the negatives. So for the negatives, speaking of plot and pacing, as I just mentioned, there was some pacing problems. Sometimes, in general, the story could be a little clunky in places. Just even when I was into it and could get going, sometimes it's hard to describe, but there was definitely some clunk going on. But I think its biggest obstacle in terms of pacing was in the first half of the series. They rushed through the forms and the books way too fast, no time to give them any story, and not every single little book needs a big storyline or anything like that. But even for some of the forms, we just rushed through it so quick you could really feel the toy commercial aspect, which is always going to be a part of it. But I think it could have been handled better. It just made it feel so meaningless and fast. And the early parts of the series, even though it wasn't always perfect, really felt hollow and strange. It almost reminded me of watching Kyoryuger Brave, where it felt like they were just distilling the Toku experience down to these little things, and I felt there wasn't a lot of heart to it, and it was just a lot of merchandise really fast. And then I think that bled into making the next arc where Toma was out of the Sword of Logos feel off. Which leads into my next negative, which is they tell but they don't show. And this is something I think they did improve on, to be fair, later in the series, but I think they spent a lot of time telling me things that they wanted me to see rather than showing me. For example, telling me how bonded these characters were, beating me over the head with how close they were, nakama, friends, all that, workplace proximity associates, especially in regards to the core three. All these puppets do is sing about how they're friends. I'm starting not to believe them. And, I think, like I said, to be fair, later in the series, I think they did a better job of it at times, and I did feel a little bit of the bond, mainly between Toma, Kento, and Luna, mainly because it tied back to their childhood, and they did a decent job with that. And I feel I felt Ryoma's feelings a little bit better in his arc, especially if you watch his little Chronicles special, and you kind of understand that he really had no regular family, so Logos was his family, that's why he stuck with them. But then when sticking with them through the Toma arc, he realized he betrayed his actual found family. And it wasn't perfect, but I did feel that a little bit, and I felt at least his feelings for the group. And like I said, amongst Luna, Kento, and Toma, I think they did a better job of that later. And in the finale, I think they did a better-ish job. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't something like, for me, like Build is a series where I really felt the bond between the characters, as a prime example. And I didn't feel that. Like, if Build was an A, this would be like a C- in terms of I was ranking the feeling of bond. But it was enough of a feeling of investment in the bonds and the story that the final arc was about to be enjoyable, which I wanted to note because sometimes there are series where the final episodes are really great, but I feel really cold to it because they did nothing to get me invested. And Saber at least did a C- job so that the arc was able to be that much more enjoyable. That being said, especially in the beginning, they spent way too much time telling me how close they were rather than showing me, and I think they wanted that to hit hard in the arc where Toma was ousted from Logos. And unfortunately, because of how rushed it was, I didn't feel the bonds. So as a result, it both made sense and didn't make sense to me how fast they turned on him. On the one hand, it's like Toma's a total outsider with all this. He's just this innocent novelist. Why would he be embroiled in this political thing? And everyone immediately betrayed him too quickly. But on the other hand, they've known this dude for 45 minutes. It's reasonable to believe he could have been a sleeper agent. Obviously, he wasn't, but it made things mixed. And it made everyone's reactions feel really strange. But I feel like there's at least no doubt that no matter what, Ren is the worst, and his reaction to this story absolutely made me despise his character. Even though he got some good stuff later, like I've mentioned in previous reviews, I enjoyed his storyline with Desad or DeCast or whatever his name is. I enjoyed that. It made for an enjoyable final arc for him, an enjoyable, awesome final scene. But his reaction to Toma was absolutely over the top. When I went back and watched his Swordsman Chronicle thing, it did make sense in the sense that he always disliked Toma because he was an outsider and was suddenly so strong, whereas he was always working towards it, but he was still way over the top. He was like an NPC. Like, no matter what happened, he would go, "He betrayed the sword!" Like, he would just shriek and freak out, and I hate him. And speaking of, I also felt that way about Toma. And again, to be fair, there was a handful of times that I liked Toma, and I think he was a good vehicle for the overall message of the show, which was how stories are important. But for the most part, I felt that they spent more time telling me why he was the specialist boy in the world rather than showing me. And at the end of the series, they did describe on paper why he was chosen, because Luna felt he could create new stories, because the World Tome and the Wonder World had everything that would ever happen already written down, but Toma would usher in new stories that had never been seen before. I get that on paper, but I never believed in him. Again, to bring it back to Build, Sento was a character that had a lot of cheesy ideals, he would say, but I believed in him. That sounded really weird and like emotional, but you know what I mean. I just didn't believe in Toma, and I felt they could have done a better job of making me not just understand on paper why he was the chosen one, but make me believe in him. And that could be a matter of personal taste and how I responded to the acting. Maybe there's some people that Toma's their favorite, but I'm just saying for me, I didn't believe in him. Now, another negative I would say is something that is going to crop up in a many Rider series no matter what, which is some characters unfortunately get left by the wayside. And like I just said, even in the most capable of hands, you could find the pitch-perfect team that will craft you the best multiple, like 10 plus Rider series you'll ever see in your life, and you're still going to have characters that get left by the wayside no matter what. That's always going to happen. That being said, Saber definitely had that problem, and I think it led to that problem in three key areas for me. Buster and Slash, the incest siblings, they weren't actually incest, but seriously, they acted creepy, and the villains. I think the villains was worst of all, but we'll get to that. In regards to Buster and Slash, they just feel like characters that would unfortunately always get left behind, and it's not a huge problem for me, but I think what bothers me is that they were around so long. I think they could have been given a little something more, and even in their Swordsman Chronicles special, compared to others, I feel like we didn't learn anything about them that we didn't already know, and that's unfortunate, because like I mentioned with Ryoma and Ren, I feel like I got a little bit of insight more into their character that you might have glossed over in the show, but they didn't get that. In regards to the siblings, I'm going to be honest, I'm fine with them just being antagonists and just focusing more on the core characters. I don't mind them getting left by the wayside. The only focus they really got on their actual development was in the crossover, but I don't mind them getting left behind. My problem was just in how weirdly they were handled. Sabella was a really good antagonist in my opinion. As mixed as that Toma being ousted from Logos arc was, she was great in that, as the actress portrayed it. She almost seemed to take pleasure in ousting Toma, which made me believe she was in on this whole corruption, but it turned out she was just a pawn in it. But then as soon as her brother shows up, she's this girl that's following her brother around like she's in love with him. And then they also have that same problem as I'm tired of antagonist writers all becoming good at the end. I get heat every time I say this. I'm not saying literally everyone. Obviously, Evolt exists, Storius exists, but I'm just saying in general, characters that are a little bit more of an antagonist or a rogue character, or sometimes literally a rogue character. I just wish that we could have some differing opinions, even if they're not full tilt evil. I'm just tired of everyone having to come around to the main character's cult. But that's a personal issue. But I'll just say that I think that they were weirdly handled. It would have been cliche, but I've said before, I think it would have been cool to have a story where one of them stayed loyal to Logos through the bitter end, and then one that, came around to Saber's side and have a sibling conflict. They were just weirdly handled. For me, the biggest area where characters getting left behind was the villains. I mentioned this numerous times in my early reviews, but because there was so many characters and so many things debuting, I basically tuned the villains out, because all they did was kind of be generic anyway, so I never bothered to learn their names. And I just was like, I don't have time for you. There's like 4 or 5 of you, and there's already a bunch of characters, and this one guy's got a faux Padawan braid. His fashion's almost as bad as Toma's, and I just tuned them out. They did get more interesting later, but they really fell by the wayside, because we didn't find out the most interesting things about them until either their last episode or when they were killed off. And they actually had a really interesting backstory. I thought they had really cool character backstories individually and as a group, and they did a good job of explaining their overall backstory, like with Tassel and stuff like that. And I think, again, much like Slash and Buster, most of them were around a long time. So even if we didn't get full development, we could have got a little something more. And something I brought up a couple times is most of them had like a direct rivalry with one of the writers. So they could have easily tied that to give development to the writer and their Megiddo rival at the same time. And I think that this whole thing was especially noticeable when it came to Storius. I felt Storius was largely in the background for most of the series, and I didn't really expect him to be the final villain until we got right down to it. And he got really interesting. Once we literally finally got his backstory in the last 2 episodes, it was a great backstory and a perfect dark mirror of Toma and what he represents both as a person and the overall story. And it's just very unfortunate that they got left behind. And I think if I had to fix anything about characters getting left behind, it would come to the villains. I had to say sort of an overall thought and kind of end on a more positive note too. Something I really did like about the series in regards to looping back to the beginning, talking about them taking advantage of both themes, I really liked the message of the series about how important stories are to people. There was a little bit of that you can write your own destiny stuff in it, which has been done before, but I think it more boiled down to how important stories are to people, and as someone who's one of my passions is just experiencing and watching and reading stories, that was a message that really resonated with me. And I like that the way that they conveyed that and the way that they, conveyed it about how important it is to children and adults alike. And I think it was a really nice core message that could be cheesy at times, but it tied in really nicely with the themes and was woven in nicely. And I really appreciated that, and I think it went through to the end. And I think Saber overall ended on a satisfying note. I wish Toma's fate was a little bit more bittersweet in regards to him maybe disappearing or only being able to appear every now and then, but it still ended fine. I didn't like the final Revice stuff we had to do, but I think it ended solid, and I'm interested in checking out the V-Cinema specials. And Saber overall is a deeply flawed series that I have many thoughts on. I could probably make one video a week for half a year, maybe a year, discussing things that I would change or fix or problems I had. But after I took a step back and was able to kind of get away from the negativity and get away from my negativity, it's an enjoyable show. I kind of dug it. I think that overall, it had some absolutely awesome stunts, awesome suits, some really cool story beats, even though it could be clunky. And I think it tied all together with the theme of stories being important. And it was a deeply flawed series, but I kind of enjoyed myself. Even when I was criticizing it, I never found myself getting that angry about it. So I would say that, yeah, it's very flawed, but I think it's worth checking out. And a possible hot take right here at the end. Oh, before the hot take, for the rating overall, I would give the series a solid 3. Yeah, that's my solid rating. But just for a hot take to leave you on here at the end, I liked it more than 0-1. I would say objectively, it's hard to say objectively, because when someone says something objectively, it's still their opinion. But objectively, even setting aside that unfortunately 0-1's ending got rushed, 0-1 is a tighter show. But I was much more invested into Saber because for me, 0-1 was an AI story I had seen 1,000 times before. And not that everything Saber did was original, as I mentioned in regards to its themes, but it was something a little bit more fresh from what I'm used to seeing from an AI story or a toku story. And I can much more get behind a protagonist that tells me about how important stories are than one that tells me that my Terminator should replace me at my job. But that's just my thoughts. It's not meant to be overly negative. I just wanted to say that. So again, Saber, deeply flawed series, but I enjoyed myself more than I thought I would, and it got me on a writer kick. But let me know what you guys think. What did you think of Saber at the end of the day and everything about it? Let me know in the comments as always. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, climb the steps and ring that bell so you know when I videos. Dawson Rider, signing out.